Hey, so the AzureStack ASDK product or developer environment from Microsoft lets you run Azure in a local environment, kind of like if you were going to run Azure Stack in your data center. So it gives you a way to do kind of a hybrid data center, or you can just run PaaS and application services locally. One of the most confusing thing if you're a newbie to Azure Stack or you're not a Microsoft certified Windows operating system data center person is the way disk drives work. Because the documentation says you need 4 data disks in your operating system disk. And the 4 data disks, I wasn't sure if it allocated them as VHDs or like what it did with it. And it turns out as soon as you run the system and you start building it out, the data disks vanish and you don't know where they go. All the VMs come up or worse, nothing happens at all and it fails. So I tried this like 3 or 4 times. I have a HP Z820 Craigslist thing, and it's got 4 drive bays in it, and it's got a couple 5 1/4s where I can stack in some extra drives. So I've actually got 6 drive bays on this. And what I did is I just took a bunch of SSDs I had and other disks that were bigger than the 200 gig required, and tried to get this thing to work, and it always failed. And then I went back and put 2 spinning disks in, two 2 terabyte spinners from an old NAS install, and a couple of small SSDs, and the thing worked right out of the box. It was crazy. I couldn't figure out what it was. So it turns out what happens is Microsoft takes the disk drives that you have as part of the provisioning process. It will make them vanish from your operating system, and it will put them under the control of Storage Manager. And it will actually, based on the type of your drive, create 2 classes of drives. One class is the data drives, and one class is the cache. So originally I didn't want spinners in here because I figured they'd be slow, but it turns out the Storage Manager actually uses the SSD as a front cache, either for in the retrieval process or in the write process for the spinners. So you still get pretty good performance. And it's really an industrial grade storage manager, but it's kind of weird if you've only ever worked with, regular VMs on your desktop or something. It just removes those drives from your view and puts them under the control of the Storage Manager. And then in my machine where I had 2 giggers, 1.7 about, formatted, that turned into 3.5 gig of storage and a performance history, and then the SSDs just vanished. I couldn't make the math work out, and it's because they're used as cache drives. So if you look at your machine, so here's what Azure Stack looks like after it's running, right? You've got, 10 or 12 machines, and all of these end up having to have VHDs, and they actually did a copy on write version, so they're all kind of low disk space. It was kind of interesting. And so every one of these ends up needing a disk. If you look at the disk drives, remember I had 6 disk drives, 0 through 5. 2, 3, 4, and 5 have vanished now, and that's because they're under the control of Storage Manager, and they no longer appear to the operating system. And the 2 drives that were generated from that, the clustered file share here, which is really where all my data disks are going to be, and this performance history mount, and then the 2 cache drives don't show up at all, the 2 SSDs. The other drive here, the other drive there is, so basically when you do Azure SDK, you install Azure SDK as a VHD on your Windows server, and then when you do that, when it reboots, it actually boots off the VHD. So you end up with the original disk, right? I'm sorry, this Server 2019 disk, but you actually booted from the VHD, so that's the mounted partition. The Windows 10 one you can ignore. We're just not using that here. It's just because I can dual boot. So the primary disk became a bootable VHD, and you can see the original disk. And the 4 disks that I had, the 2 data disks became merged together, and the cache disk vanished. So you can also see this. I didn't know about this before because I've never used it. If you go to the Failover Cluster Manager and you click, so this is the cluster they actually create. You'll see this created as part of the construction process, right? And if you look at the nodes of that, you can see the disk drives that make up that cluster. So in my case, I have 2 1.8 terabyte hard drives, so those are spinners, Western Digital NAS drives. And then I had 2 random, a Kingston hyperdrive, HyperX or something, and an old Lite-On that became the SSDs. And you can see it actually did that. You do no configuration. The cluster manager will pick the right drives and tune for size and performance. So that's really cool from my point of view, because I didn't have to manage it, right? It's a little weird though if you haven't seen it before. So the drives vanish. It builds up all these Hyper-V machines. They all get virtual drives from the storage cluster, which is made up of your physical drives, but it's really hidden from you. The storage is almost treated like a separate subsystem, and then the VHDs come out of that, and they're never mounted on the host, so you don't see them when you look at the disk management section. So really, I just wanted to put this together because when you first play with this and you read the instructions, it would be really nice if they explained, they tell you what the minimum data drives are, but they don't tell you how they be used. So when you go to your parts bin or you order drives or something, you really don't know what the right thing is to order. And it turns out in this case, this was the easiest configuration for me. Getting it to work from VHDs only was hard. Booting a nested virtual machine I didn't get working. But as soon as I put a mix of data drives and SSDs in here, it immediately, and they were all big enough. I think it was really, I didn't have any SSDs that were big enough. It automatically converted those into a storage manager managed file system. It built a data drive and a cache cluster, and boom, we were ready to go. So that's what you needed to know if you want to have some idea how AzureStack ASDK manages its disk drives and why they don't show up in your partition and disk drive manager. Have a great day.